Ukrainians discovered the plans of Russians to invade from the north, so most likely it's not happening. So all these preparations by Russians in Belarus are now completely meaningless. At the same time, it looks like that Russians are bringing all of their power to the east in the attempt to encircle Bakhmut. And finally, Russians started to acknowledge the fact that Ukrainians will be able to cross Dnipro river. And because of this, they started to retreat deeper into Kherson region, as well as Zaporozhye region. But you know what? This region is no longer safe either. But more about all of this in just a couple of minutes. What's up, investors? It's the Russian dude. And let's go straight to the point and see some most recent footage. And our first video comes to us from Russian city Tver, and as you can see right here, a convoy of Ukrainian military vehicles has been spotted on the streets. The local residents were extremely confused, but apparently these are the props for a movie. Our next picture comes to us from Ivano-Frankovsky Monastery, and as you can see right here, the security services of Ukraine came to do a search in this place. And as a result of this search, a lot of pro-Russian materials were discovered, which were basically justifying the non-existence of Ukraine, and that in fact, historically, it should belong to Russia. Our next stop brings us to Kiev, where we can see the Prime Minister of Poland, Mateusz Morawiecki, visiting the capital. He stopped at Holodomor Memorial and also spoke with Ukrainian authorities about this allegedly Ukrainian missile incident in Poland, which happened several weeks ago. And then we go to Dnipro, where you can see from this video, the city has been under attack by Russians. And as a result of this shelling, several residential buildings have been either partially or completely destroyed. It is estimated that since the beginning of this war, approximately 32% of Ukrainians have lost their belongings, as you can see from this chart. And then according to the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, in only 9 months, Russia did approximately 16,000 attacks against Ukrainian territory, and around 97% of these attacks were against civilian infrastructure. Ukraine already went through several mass shellings by Russians, but unfortunately it might get a little bit worse in the nearest future, because reportedly a Russian battleship carrying caliber missiles returned to the Black Sea. And approximately 20 Tu-95 bombers were located to Engels Airport, located in Saratov region. And according to the representative of Ukrainian military, Yevgeny Karas, there is approximately 90% chance of another massive shelling by Russians this Tuesday. So, if you are in Ukraine, please be careful and do not ignore the air raid sirens. And now let's really quickly talk about this failed attempt by Russians to invade Ukraine from Belarus. If you remember, for the last several weeks there were many reports about Russians concentrating their forces on the border with Ukraine. And supposedly, these military units were supposed to invade Ukraine from the north. But I mean, come on, this plan was doomed to fail since the very beginning, because Russia is barely advancing as it is in the east and the south, so there is no way for them to open another front. But anyways, because according to the defense intelligence of Ukraine, they see absolutely no signs that Russia will be advancing from Belarus. The report also claims that most likely the reason for these quote-quote tactics was that Ukrainians will relocate some of its forces to the north, which basically means that the south and the east will become less protected, which will allow Russians to be a little bit more successful. But now, since it is pretty much confirmed that Russians will not be invading from the north, they will have to relocate these forces back into the east, which, to be honest, is the only thing that makes sense, as Russians trying their best to claim victory at least somewhere. And the most promising location at this very moment is Bakhmut, and we will talk about this in more details very soon. It might feel like nothing much is happening at this very moment, but both Russians and Ukrainians are assembling their forces for the next stages of the counteroffensive. And if you don't want to miss any of these updates as soon as they start happening, please consider liking this video and subscribing to my channel. You can also follow me on Instagram and send me a message and I will reply to you. Alright, and now let me give you a very brief update from the east of Ukraine. First of all, it has been reported that a Russian military convoy has been spotted in Bilokurakine, bringing reinforcements and supplies to Svatove. At the same time, Ukrainians continue to shell Russian military positions in the city, as well as trying to advance from the northwest. And then severe fighting has also been reported to the west of Kreminna in the forest area. At the same time, Russians tried to advance closer to Bilohirivka, Solidar and Bakhmutske, but all of these attacks have been repelled by Ukrainians. And at the same time, one of the most significant combat activity was reported around Spirne, with both countries constantly shelling each other. But without a doubt, the main battle of the east at this very moment is happening in Bakhmut. As you can see from this video, these are the conditions that Ukrainian soldiers have to go through every single day because of rainy season. One of the main directions of Russian attacks was coming from the northeast of this city, and at the same time Russians also tried to approach from Opotne and Ivanohrad. In addition to that, Russians had partial success in Ozaryanivka, and reportedly they continued to walk to the north. And based on this map, which shows us the changes in territorial control, we can indeed see that Russians were able to capture a part of this settlement. As you might already know, one of the main forces of Russians fighting for Bakhmut is Wagner military company. And the reason why Russians are relatively successful in this location, it is because they constantly reinforce these positions with fresh conscripts. Because of this, Ukrainians are able to constantly inflict severe losses on Russians, and at the same time they're able to stand their ground. It all looks like that the main goal of Russia at this stage of war is to capture Bakhmut no matter what. And as you can see, it already costs them a lot of soldiers, and they're not planning to stop. And because of severe fighting for this city in the last several months, on this video you can see the current condition of Bakhmut. Russians also tried to advance next to Kamenka, Yakovlevka and Pavlivka, but all of these attacks were repelled by Ukrainians. As you have seen from the previous video, the reason both Russians and Ukrainians are advancing very slow at this very moment, it is because it is a rain season in Ukraine. But it is expected that as soon as winter approaches and the ground freezes, the battles will resume. Speaking about the footage, I am not able to use more than 90% of photos in videos in my episodes. For this reason, I upload some of them to my Discord, and the rest will be available on my Patreon. And if you want to see this unacceptable footage, the links will be down below. Alright, and before we talk about some very promising news from the south, allow me to give you some updates from Zaporozhye region, which are also quite interesting. And first of all, according to several reports, Ukrainians were able to destroy Russian military positions in Polokhy. At the same time, Ukrainians were able to destroy a bridge in Zaporozhye region, which Russians were using to deliver weapons. And this bridge I'm talking about is the railway bridge located to the south of Starobogdanivka. As you can see from this map, the railroads are represented by these white lines. And by targeting this bridge, Ukrainians were able to at least partially disrupt the logistics of Russians to the east, to Kherson and even to Crimea. And by the way, I was already talking about the desire of Ukrainians to advance to Tokmak in my previous videos. And one of the main reasons for this, if you remember, is to intercept retreating Russians from Kherson to the east, and at the same time, in the nearest future, to liberate Melitopol, which is one of the most important cities in the south. And the attack against this railway bridge basically brings Ukrainians one step closer towards achieving this goal. And then according to this article, there are signs that Russians are planning to leave Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. The president of Energoatom Petro Kotin claims that Russians are packing their bags, stealing everything they see and preparing to transfer the ownership over this nuclear power plant to the International Atomic Energy Agency. And even though it might be way too early to tell that they are leaving the territory of this plant, they are most certainly preparing to do so. In addition to that, reportedly, Russians also mined the territory of the plant. But the response of Russia is that the retreat from Zaporozhye nuclear power plant is impossible. And basically, yeah, no reasons why, no explanations, just like this. It is not possible. But you always have to remember that whenever reading the Russian propaganda news, you always have to interpret it in the completely opposite way. Because according to the overall sentiment of Russians in the media, they are greatly concerned about Ukrainian counteroffensive against Melitopol. Alright, and before we talk about the upcoming full liberation of Kherson region, as well as where this counteroffensive will begin, let's really quick talk about other news from the south. And in this first video from Kherson, we can see that Russians continue to constantly shell this city. Then right here we can see the main reason why the Ukrainian forces asked the residents of Kherson to wait a little bit longer before returning to their homes. Because one of the things to do during these so-called stabilization activities is to remove all the mines from residential areas which Russians left while withdrawing. In addition to that, if you remember from several weeks ago, the local authorities advised the residents of Kherson to evacuate from the city. And as you can see right here, some locals decided to follow this advice. And speaking about the withdrawal of Russians, during their retreat they abandoned a lot of military equipment and vehicles. And as you can see right here, Russia left approximately $2 billion worth of such presents to Ukraine, which makes Russia to be one of the biggest donors to Ukraine. Over the last several days, the main concentration of Russian artillery strikes was against Kherson city. In response to that, Ukrainians were targeting Russian military objects in Oleshki and Holopristan. And reportedly, they were even able to destroy a Russian military warehouse in Radensk. And also, Ukrainian partisans and special forces were able to cross Dnipro river, most likely to collect the intelligence data and to engage in basic combat activity. But the biggest news of today comes to us from the report by the Institute for the Study of War. It pretty much says that the Russian military commandment acknowledges the fact that Ukrainians can cross Dnipro river and engage in a massive counteroffensive. And this counteroffensive will also threaten Russian critical ground lines of communication, including the ones which go to Crimea. So what Russians are basically trying to say is that yes, there is a risk that Ukrainians will disrupt our logistics in Kherson and push us away from Kherson region. And ultimately, they are risking to leave the entire Crimea separated. But to show at least some kind of resistance, Russians are trying to build defensive positions in Kherson. And at the same time, reportedly, they understand that this will not be able to hold Ukrainians, but only slow them down. Right here, for example, you can see the reported locations of such defense lines. Most of these defenses, which include, for example, the trenches and the dragon teeth concrete pyramids, are constructed along these critical roads, about which we are talking recently. And at the same time, such defensive constructions are spotted going as far as close to Melitopol, Crimea and Kinburn Spit, which once again kinda allows you to assume that Russians subconsciously gave up on Kherson region and now they are preparing to defend something else. We even have some satellite images of such defenses, and I will show them to you right now. The first one is from Stepne, located in Kherson region, and shows us some fortifications and trenches. The second one is from Novotroitske, also from Kherson region, and we can see pretty much the same. And the third one is from Velika Blakhoveshchenka, and besides trenches, we can also see the dragon teeth. Most likely, Russians are not planning to defend Kherson region, they are only trying to slow down Ukrainians. One of the potential reasons for this, it is because they are allegedly waiting for more reinforcements to come. Some people think that Russians might even attempt to recapture Kherson, but honestly, I don't think that's the case. Because most likely, the reason why would they want to slow down Ukrainians is so that Russians can retreat along with their military vehicles and equipment, instead of just abandoning it and letting Ukrainians capturing even more vehicles and ammunition. If you also remember, at this very moment there are 3 lines of defense of Russians in Kherson, and the furthest one is located approximately 20 kilometers away from Dnipro river. According to the same report, Russians deployed recent conscripts to the first lines of defense while pulling more experienced soldiers to the back. So it looks like that Russians already gave up on Kherson region, and Ukrainians will obviously want to retake it. But the main question remains the same: where this counteroffensive will most likely come from? And based on my previous assumptions, which were recently indirectly confirmed by the Institute for the Study of War, Ukrainians will most likely try to cross Dnipro river and land in Kinburn Spit. Most likely, this will not be the main location for Ukrainians to cross the river, but instead they will use this territory to approach Russians from behind. And at the same time, this will motivate Russians to retreat even further. Because of this, other, bigger and much more promising locations will become opened for Ukrainians. Potentially, the biggest chunk of Ukrainian forces will be crossing Dnipro river next to Kherson city and Novokakhovka. At first, Russians will be withdrawing to Crimea, deeper into Kherson and to Zaporozhye region, which means that we might see the liberation of these territories very quick. And as soon as Ukrainians will be able to push Russians away from the deepest corners of Kherson, this is when the ultimate liberation of these territories will be completed. And if you don't want to miss any of these updates as soon as they start happening, just please once again subscribe to my channel. It only takes 1 click. If you want to support my work, please consider becoming my channel member, use a PayPal link or become a Patreon, where you'll receive additional content. You can find all the other useful links to the right and down below. Thank you so much for your attention, товарищи, and see you tomorrow.